The flight was smooth. The cabin was quiet. And then, without warning, the flight attendant slapped a black woman across the face in front of everyone. What she didn't know was that the woman's billionaire husband was sitting just 2 rows behind, watching everything. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy powerful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a new one. She stood quietly in the first-class cabin, adjusting her shawl as she placed her handbag carefully in the overhead bin. Her name was Amara. Her skin was smooth and dark, her posture graceful, and her face calm. She wore a soft beige dress and low heels. Not flashy, but elegant. A few passengers glanced her way but quickly turned back to their phones and newspapers. She didn't mind. She wasn't here to be noticed. She just wanted to settle into her seat and enjoy the flight. She placed her phone on airplane mode, slid it into her bag, and sat down near the window, looking out at the bright afternoon sky. Her eyes softened as she stared outside. It was a peaceful moment, but it didn't last long. The flight attendant came down the aisle, checking tickets and offering polite smiles to the passengers, until her eyes landed on Amara. Her name was Denise. Her expression shifted. Her steps slowed. She looked Amara up and down, her polite smile fading into something colder. She didn't say anything at first. Instead, she walked past, then turned back as if reconsidering. She leaned slightly forward, her voice clipped and sharp. "Excuse me, ma'am. Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Denise asked, eyeing Amara's shawl and handbag. Amara looked up, confused but polite. She nodded and reached into her handbag to pull out her ticket. She handed it over. Denise barely glanced at it before frowning deeper. "This is a first-class ticket," she said, her tone changing like she was explaining something to a child. "This section is for first-class passengers only." "I know," Amara replied softly. "This is my seat." Denise's eyes narrowed. She didn't return the ticket. She held it in her hand and tilted her head. "Are you flying alone?" she asked, loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. Amara gave a small nod. "Yes." Denise let out a breath through her nose, like she was already annoyed. She returned the ticket slowly, then straightened her back. "I'm going to have to ask you to remove your bag from the overhead bin and come with me to the back," she said firmly. "There may have been a system error." Amara blinked. "But this is my assigned seat." "Ma'am," Denise interrupted, now sounding impatient. "I don't want to repeat myself." A few people were watching now. Some pretended not to listen, but their eyes flicked back and forth between the two. Amara didn't argue. She reached up, pulled down her bag without help, and stood up quietly. Her hands trembled slightly, but she didn't show it. She didn't want to cause a scene. She just wanted to sit and fly in peace. But her silence didn't protect her. As she stepped into the aisle, Denise muttered under her breath, just loud enough for Amara to hear. "This is what happens when people try to act above their place." The words hit like a slap. Amara froze, just for a second. Her face stayed calm, but her chest tightened. She said nothing. She turned and began to walk toward the back of the plane. That's when a voice rose from one of the nearby seats behind her. Calm, clear, controlled. "Is this how you speak to your passengers?" Denise stopped. Her shoulders stiffened. She turned slowly, and that's when she saw him, the man sitting 2 rows behind, silent until now, watching everything. His name was Malik. His face was expressionless, his eyes steady. He was dressed in a dark blazer, phone resting on his lap. Not a wrinkle on his shirt, not a trace of anger in his tone. But the weight of his words changed the air instantly. Amara paused mid-step. Her eyes widened slightly. She knew that voice. She knew exactly who it belonged to. But no one else on that plane did. Not yet. Denise's breath caught in her throat as her eyes locked with Malik's. For a moment she couldn't place him. There was something about the way he sat, so composed, so still, that unsettled her. She gave a tight smile, trying to recover. "Sir, is there a problem?" she asked, her voice thin now. no longer carrying that edge of control she had used with Amara? Malik didn't answer right away. He looked at Amara, still standing in the aisle with her bag in her hand, then back at Denise. "I asked you a question," he said evenly. "Is this how you speak to every passenger? Or only the ones who look like her?" The words hung in the air like heavy smoke. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One woman near the window lowered her phone, pretending not to be listening. The man in the aisle seat beside Malik glanced sideways but said nothing. Denise straightened, trying to hold on to her usual tone. "Sir, there's no issue here. There may have been a mix-up with the seating chart. I was simply following procedure." Malik's eyes didn't blink. "She showed you her ticket." "Yes, but—" "And yet you still told her to leave." Denise opened her mouth, then closed it again. She wasn't used to this. Most passengers didn't question her, especially not in front of others. She turned back to Amara. "Please, if you'll just take a seat in the back for now. We'll sort it out once we're in the air." But Amara didn't move. She stood still, her grip tightening slightly on the strap of her bag. She looked toward Malik, uncertain what to do. Malik gave her a small nod. "Sit down," he said calmly. But it wasn't a suggestion. It was a decision. Amara hesitated for a breath, then quietly stepped back into her seat, placing her bag gently under the seat in front of her. She didn't look at Denise. She didn't have to. Denise stood frozen, eyes bouncing between Malik and Amara. Her lips parted like she wanted to protest, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the silence in the cabin. Maybe it was the calm weight of Malik's voice. Or maybe it was finally starting to dawn on her who he was. She took a step back. "I'll inform the captain," she muttered, then turned and walked away, her shoulders stiff. Malik leaned back in his seat, picked up his phone and scrolled slowly, like nothing had happened. But his jaw was locked, and his eyes didn't lift once until Denise disappeared behind the curtain. Behind the curtain, Denise's hands trembled as she reached for a cup of water in the galley. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, but this felt different. That man, his voice, his stare, it had unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. She tried to steady herself, taking a sip, forcing her breath to slow. One of the junior attendants, a soft-spoken girl named Tanya, looked over from the coffee machine. "You okay?" she asked cautiously. Denise nodded quickly, brushing past her. "I'm fine, just sorting out a seating error. That woman in 2A, she doesn't belong there. Probably slipped through during check-in." Tanya blinked. "She had a first-class ticket. I saw her board." Denise's expression hardened. "Tickets can be bought. Doesn't mean it wasn't a mistake." Tanya opened her mouth, then closed it. She had learned early not to argue with Denise, but something about the situation didn't sit right. She watched as Denise pulled out a tablet and began tapping the screen. In the cabin, Amara sat perfectly still. Her hands rested on her lap, fingers laced together. Her eyes remained fixed on the window, but her mind was spinning. She hadn't even processed the slap of humiliation yet. It all happened so fast. And now she felt the weight of the stares from around her, even if most passengers were pretending to be busy. Malik, seated just behind her, remained silent. But his presence was impossible to ignore. Amara hadn't expected him to be on this flight. He was supposed to leave a day later. She hadn't told anyone about her plans, not even him. Yet, here he was, sitting in the row behind her, watching everything unfold. She remembered what he always told her when things got unfair. "Let them reveal themselves. Then I'll deal with it." He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't threatened anyone. But the moment he spoke, everything changed. And something told Amara, this wasn't over. Not even close. Denise reappeared from behind the curtain a few minutes later, trying to act composed. Her lips were tight, and her steps were brisk, but she avoided looking directly at Amara or Malik. She walked through the first-class cabin, checking seatbelts as if nothing had happened, but her eyes flicked nervously toward the cockpit door. She had already radioed the captain, and reported a possible incident with a confused passenger. She didn't mention the part where she had raised her voice. She certainly didn't mention the part where she had humiliated someone in front of a full cabin. And she didn't mention the man who had stepped in, because truthfully, she still didn't know who he was. But Malik knew what she had said, and he wasn't going to forget it. Amara sat quietly, her head tilted slightly to the side, staring out the window. She hadn't moved since sitting back down. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking, but her jaw was tight, and her shoulders held a quiet tension. She pulled her phone from her handbag and slowly typed a message. Her hands hesitated before hitting send. She tried to remove me from my seat. She didn't believe my ticket. She humiliated me in front of everyone. She hit send and waited. Seconds later, the screen lit up with a reply. I saw everything. Sit tight. Don't say anything. I'll handle it. Malik didn't look up from his screen. He didn't need to. The situation was already in motion. At the front of the plane, the cockpit light blinked. The captain picked up the call from the flight attendant's line. Yes? Denise's voice came through, too calm to be honest. Captain, there may be a problem with a first-class passenger. The woman in seat 2A. I believe she may be in the wrong seat. There's some confusion. The captain frowned. She has a valid ticket? Denise hesitated. I didn't check the manifest yet, but I think... You think? The captain interrupted, his tone sharpening. I'll double-check now, she said quickly, realizing her mistake. Do it fast, the captain said, and don't cause a scene. She hung up and swallowed hard. Back in the cabin, Malik slowly raised his head. His eyes moved toward the curtain where Denise had just disappeared again. He didn't say a word, but there was a quiet calculation in his face, like someone already writing the ending before the middle had even played out. The plane hadn't taken off yet, but something had already shifted in the air. The engines began to hum gently as the plane prepared for takeoff. Passengers adjusted their seats, fastened belts, and settled in. But in the first-class cabin, comfort had vanished. The air was tight with silent tension. Amara leaned her head against the window, pretending to admire the clouds gathering in the distance. But her mind was far from calm. She could still feel the sting, not on her skin, but in her chest. The embarrassment, the way Denise had looked at her, questioned her, spoke to her like she didn't belong. And the worst part, no one had said anything, not one passenger spoke up, not one person asked if she was okay. Only Malik. She hadn't even known he was there. She hadn't seen him during boarding. She assumed he was on a different flight. But the moment he spoke, so calm, so steady, everything inside her shifted. She felt seen, not just as his wife, but as a person who deserved to be treated with dignity. Meanwhile, Denise stood behind the curtain with the manifest now in her hands, fingers gripping it tighter than necessary. Her eyes ran over the list once, then again. There it was. Seat 2A. Amara Thompson. Paid in full. First class. No errors, no transfers, no upgrades. Everything was in order. But she still didn't believe it. Or maybe deep down she didn't want to believe it. Something about Amara had triggered her. The quiet confidence. The way she took her seat without hesitation. The fact that she didn't seem nervous or lost. The way Denise thought a woman like her should look in first class. She folded the manifest and stuffed it into the folder with more force than necessary. Tanya, standing near the back counter, watched her quietly. She was on the list, Denise muttered, like it was a problem she hadn't expected. I figured, Tanya replied, her voice low. Denise didn't answer. She stepped forward to return to the cabin but stopped just short of pulling back the curtain. Her hand hovered near the fabric, then dropped. Do you know who that man was? She asked suddenly. Tanya looked up. Which man? The one who spoke up, sitting in 4C. Tanya thought for a second. But he didn't seem like someone you'd want to argue with. Denise narrowed her eyes, remembering the way he looked at her. Not with anger, with disappointment, like she had revealed something ugly about herself and he didn't even need to say it out loud. Back in the cabin, Malik finally looked up from his phone. His fingers moved with purpose, tapping out a short message. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't tense. His face carried the stillness of someone completely in control. Contact legal. I want the cabin recording pulled after landing. Also notify the operations director. I need a call scheduled the moment we touch down. He pressed send and placed the phone face down on the tray table. Across the aisle, a businessman who had watched everything glanced over at Malik, clearly curious. He opened his mouth, as if to speak, then thought better of it. There was something about Malik's silence that discouraged casual conversation. Amara, without turning her head, spoke softly. You were supposed to fly tomorrow. Malik's voice came back just as soft. Plans changed. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the moment settle. She didn't ask how long he had been sitting there. She didn't ask what he was planning. She didn't need to. She knew him well enough to understand. He didn't move without reason. And if he had changed his flight without telling anyone, he had felt something was coming. The plane lifted off the runway, the ground slowly falling away beneath them. A calm voice came over the intercom, welcoming passengers and giving the expected flight time. But no one in the first few rows was listening. They were too aware of the strange, silent weight pressing down over them. Denise finally returned to the cabin, walking down the aisle as if nothing had happened. She didn't glance at Amara. She didn't glance at Malik, but she could feel his eyes follow her with every step. She tried to focus on offering drinks, on keeping her voice cheerful. But something in her rhythm had changed. She wasn't in control anymore. And Malik hadn't even raised his voice. The seatbelt sign dimmed with a soft chime, and passengers began to shift more comfortably in their seats. A few opened books, others adjusted their trays, and some whispered quietly among themselves. But in first class, the silence remained. Amara hadn't touched the blanket on her lap or reached for the magazine in the seat pocket. She sat upright, arms folded, eyes steady. Her body was still, but her thoughts weren't. She wasn't angry in the way most people understood anger. It wasn't loud or wild. It was quiet, heavy. That kind of anger that sat deep in the chest like a stone. She had lived her life with grace, never demanding attention, never expecting trouble. But today had reminded her how easily people looked at her and saw something else, something less. And Denise hadn't just questioned a ticket. She had questioned her right to belong. Denise, meanwhile, was doing what she always did when a situation began to slip, pretending nothing was wrong. She moved quickly between rows, offering drinks with a practiced smile. Water, juice, coffee. Everything mechanical, everything routine. But her hands weren't steady. When she leaned down to serve the passenger in 1D, her hand trembled slightly as she placed the cup on the tray. She was waiting for something to happen, waiting for Malik to speak again, waiting for Amara to report her. But so far, nothing, and that silence made it worse. At the galley, Tanya approached her quietly. You want me to take the next round? She offered, her voice light but careful. Denise gave a quick shake of the head. No, I'm fine. But she wasn't fine. And when she looked past Tanya toward the first-class curtain, she felt the burn of eyes she couldn't see. That man, Malik. Something about the way he looked at her kept playing over and over in her mind. Calm. Sharp. Like he knew something she didn't. In the back of the cabin, a flight crew member approached Tanya with a small slip of paper and whispered something. Tanya's brows rose slightly. Then she nodded and turned toward the cockpit. Denise didn't ask what it was. She had a feeling it wasn't good. She turned her back and reached for the card again, trying to focus. But up front, things were already moving. Malik tapped on his phone again, quietly this time. He typed a short message. Get me the in-flight supervisor. I want to speak to them before landing. Quietly, no drama. I want it handled professionally. Then he slipped the phone away and folded his hands in his lap. Amara leaned slightly back, eyes still on the window. She spoke without looking at him. You're handling it already, aren't you? Malik didn't answer immediately. He tilted his head just slightly and replied, I told you before. People show you who they are when they think no one's watching. She nodded slowly. She remembered those words. He had said them the first time someone followed her around a store like she might steal something. And now here they were again, 30,000 feet in the air, watching the same truth unfold in a different uniform. Denise returned to Amara's row with a small cup of sparkling water. She placed it down carefully on the tray, her voice clipped and low. "Here you go, ma'am." Amara looked up slowly, eyes meeting hers. "No thank you." No expression, just silence. Denise stood there for a second too long, then turned away. But the moment she stepped away, she heard it. A low murmur behind her from one of the other passengers. She didn't even apologize. Denise froze mid-step. She didn't turn around. She just kept walking, pretending she hadn't heard it. But she had, and so had others. In first class, something had shifted. The passengers, once silent, once uninterested, were now watching everything. Some with discomfort, others with quiet guilt. Because they had seen it happen. They had seen a woman humiliated in front of them. And they had done nothing. Malik didn't need to raise his voice. Amara didn't need to cry. The truth had already made its way around the cabin, and it was sitting in every seat, pressing on every passenger's conscience. And Denise? Denise was finally starting to feel what it meant to lose control. The hum of the engines faded into background noise as the flight continued. A stillness hung in the air, thick, uneasy. People shifted in their seats, adjusted blankets, flipped through pages of untouched magazines, but their eyes kept drifting back to the same place. Amara. Not because she was making noise, not because she was asking for attention, but because her silence made them uncomfortable. Her stillness made them remember what they saw, and how they said nothing. One older woman in seat 1A clutched her purse a little tighter, pretending to read a novel. A young man 2 rows behind snuck glances toward Malik, trying to confirm what he now suspected. It had taken him a while, but it clicked. He had seen that face before, on television, on a magazine cover, in a news interview. That man in the crisp black blazer sitting so quietly behind the woman who had been humiliated. That was him. The one who owned a tech empire, who gave speeches about equity and leadership, who never raised his voice but still got entire rooms to listen. That was Malik Harris. And no one, not the passengers, not Denise, not even the captain, had realized he was on the plane. Until now. Tanya returned from the cockpit and leaned toward Denise near the galley, her voice low but urgent. "You need to come up front," she said. Denise turned, confused. "Why? What happened?" Tanya hesitated, then added, "The captain wants to speak with you. Right now." Denise followed her with stiff steps, feeling every inch of the walk through the narrow aisle. Passengers watched her pass, some openly now. She tried not to show it, but inside, her pulse had picked up speed. She knocked on the cockpit door and waited until the lock clicked. Inside, the captain sat rigidly in his seat, his face unreadable. Beside him, on the secure video line, was the airline's in-flight operations manager, his face serious, his tie slightly loosened like he had been pulled into the conversation mid-shift. "Ms. Denise," the captain began flatly, "we've just received a call from the corporate office. There's been a complaint about a passenger interaction in first class." Denise's heart dropped. It was a misunderstanding," she began. "There was confusion over the seat. I thought did she show you her boarding pass?" The man on the video screen asked sharply. Denise paused. "Yes, but I didn't realize." "Did you verify the name on the manifest?" "I did, but after..." "So you asked her to move before confirming her information?" Denise opened her mouth to defend herself, but the captain raised his hand slightly, stopping her. "You need to understand something," he said, his voice growing firmer. "The man in seat 4C is Malik Harris." Denise blinked. I didn't know that." The man on the screen leaned forward. "And the woman you embarrassed in front of the entire cabin is his wife." Silence filled the cockpit. Denise felt her knees weaken slightly. "He's already contacted legal," the captain continued. "He hasn't made a scene. He hasn't spoken to the press. But he has every right to take this to the board, and from what we've been told, he's planning to. Denise tried to find words. It wasn't personal. I didn't recognize her. I was just trying to... You didn't need to recognize her, the manager interrupted coldly. You needed to treat her like every other passenger in that cabin, and you failed. The call ended. The screen went black. Denise stood there, still frozen. The captain turned slightly in his seat. You'll need to apologize. Not later. Now, and you'll do it in front of the passengers who saw what happened. Denise's stomach turned. But, no excuses, the captain said. You created this situation. Now you fix it. He turned back to his controls, the conversation over. Denise stepped out of the cockpit slowly, her mind blank. She walked toward the first-class cabin again, this time feeling every step like a spotlight was on her back. She passed the rows of faces watching, the eyes she had once ignored, the judgment she now couldn't escape. Amara sat calmly, sipping the water that had been placed on her tray. Malik didn't even turn his head, but he didn't have to. She knew Denise was coming, and Denise knew. This wasn't just a flight anymore. This was the beginning of a fall. Denise stood just past the curtain separating the galley from the first-class cabin, her hand gripping the edge of the wall. Her legs felt stiff. Her mouth was dry. She could still hear the captain's voice echoing in her head. You created this situation. Now you fix it. She had played this moment in her mind a dozen different ways during the flight, imagining that maybe it would all blow over, that maybe Amara would quietly let it go, that maybe no one would realize who that man behind her really was. But all of that had just collapsed. She stepped into the cabin slowly. Her eyes swept the rows she had walked past with such confidence earlier, and now every face she had ignored looked straight at her. Some curious, some cold, some just waiting to see how she would try to clean up what she'd done. Her feet carried her forward until she reached row 2. Amara sat poised, calm, back straight, hands folded lightly on her lap. She wasn't smug. She wasn't confrontational. She simply watched Denise approach with the quiet control of someone who had already won, without raising her voice, without lifting a hand. Behind her, Malik sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the back of Denise's head. The pressure of his gaze alone felt heavier than a crowd. Denise swallowed and crouched slightly, keeping her voice low but loud enough for those nearby to hear. Ma'am, I owe you an apology, she said, the words stumbling out of her mouth. There was a misunderstanding earlier. I acted too quickly and She paused, trying to steady her tone. I shouldn't have asked you to move seats. I'm sorry if I caused any embarrassment. Amara raised her eyebrows slightly. A misunderstanding? She asked, not angry, just curious. Denise nodded quickly. Yes, I didn't mean to offend you, but you did, Amara said, her voice calm but clear. You looked at me and decided I didn't belong here. That wasn't a system error, that was your judgment. Denise froze. She could feel the weight of every passenger's attention now. Dozens of ears tuned into this conversation. Amara didn't yell. She didn't need to. Her tone was calm, composed, even soft, but every word carried. You didn't ask anyone else for their ticket, Amara continued. You didn't doubt the man in 1C or the woman in 3A, only me. Denise opened her mouth, searching for an excuse, something to explain herself, but there was nothing to say. Behind them, someone muttered, "She's right," and another passenger nodded silently. Malik didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence made everything louder. Amara leaned back in her seat, eyes still on Denise. So, if you're going to apologize, at least call it what it was. Denise stood there, frozen in front of a woman she had tried to shame, now holding the full attention of the cabin. Her fingers twitched against her apron. She felt exposed in a way she had never experienced before. This wasn't a private conversation anymore. This was a reckoning. I misjudged you, Denise said at last. Her voice broke slightly around the edges. Amara nodded once. That's the truth. There was a long pause. Denise waited, unsure what to do next. Amara didn't dismiss her, didn't thank her, didn't say anything more. She simply turned back to the window and picked up her glass of water. Conversation over. Denise straightened slowly and stepped back down the aisle, her face flushed. She couldn't look anyone in the eye. Not the woman she'd shamed, not the man she'd underestimated, not the passengers who had watched it all unfold. She returned to the galley and stood still, gripping the edge of the cart as if she might collapse. Her legs felt weak. Her thoughts raced. She had lost something bigger than just respect. She had lost control of the story. And now she was no longer the person correcting others. She was the one being corrected. Tanya glanced at her from across the narrow space and said quietly, "That was brutal." Denise didn't respond, because deep down she knew it wasn't even over yet. The cabin settled into a quiet rhythm again, but it wasn't peace. It was tension, wrapped in silence. Denise didn't return to the aisle for a while. She stayed in the galley, busying herself with rearranging things that didn't need rearranging, wiping trays that were already clean. Her ears still burned. The apology hadn't helped. If anything, it had made everything more real. The moment she had crouched in front of Amara and spoken those words, she had crossed from being the one in charge to being the one exposed. And the silence that followed her apology was the loudest response she could have received. Passengers in first class remained unusually quiet. Nobody said much, but everyone was paying attention. It wasn't just about Denise anymore. It was about them too, about how none of them had spoken up when it happened. Now they watched Amara differently, not with judgment, not with confusion, but with a quiet kind of respect and discomfort, because they had seen it happen, and they had looked away. Amara sat with her arms resting lightly on the armrest, her fingers slowly tracing the rim of her glass. Her expression hadn't changed, but her mind was spinning. She hadn't expected the apology, and when it came, it felt incomplete. Like Denise was saying what she had to, not what she meant. The kind of apology people give when they're caught, not when they're sorry. She wasn't looking for revenge. She didn't want Denise fired or dragged across the news. But she did want something to change. She had seen women like herself pushed aside too many times, spoken to with fake smiles and loaded tones, treated like guests in rooms they paid to enter. She glanced back briefly. Malik was still in his seat, flipping through a document on his tablet, as calm as ever. He hadn't said another word, but Amara knew him too well. She could feel it, the stillness he carried when he was preparing something big. Few rows back, the man in 3B finally leaned forward slightly, clearing his throat. "I saw what happened earlier," he said gently, speaking toward Amara without looking directly at her. "That wasn't right." Amara turned her head. "No," she said. "It wasn't." He nodded once, then leaned back in his seat, his hands resting awkwardly on his knees. He didn't know what else to say. But even that small moment, that simple sentence, shifted something in the air. Another voice from across the aisle followed quietly. "We all saw it. We should have said something." Amara didn't respond to that one. She didn't need to. The shame in their voices spoke for itself. Up in the cockpit, the captain tapped the intercom button again and called down to the operations team. His voice was calm, but clipped. "Begin arrangements for executive handling upon landing. Confirm with legal and security." "Copy that," the voice on the other end replied. "Mr. Harris requested privacy for his wife, but he wants formal review started before the plane touches ground." "Understood," the captain replied. He leaned back in his seat and glanced at the empty sky ahead. This was no longer a flight. It was a moment the entire airline would be talking about before the day ended. Back in the galley, Denise picked up the interphone, hesitated, then slowly dialed a direct number to crew control. It rang once before a man's voice answered. "This is crew support. Go ahead," her voice wavered. "This is Denise Porter, flight lead on 827. I need to file a preliminary incident report for first-class passenger misconduct. Correction, crew misconduct. My own. There was a pause on the line. Copy that. Noted. Denise hung up, her shoulders slumped. She felt like she was shrinking with every passing minute. For years, she had walked down plane aisles with authority, correcting passengers, commanding respect. She had gotten too used to being the final word, and now she was the subject of an official report. Her own voice had put her there. Back in her seat, Amara scrolled slowly through her phone. She had received dozens of messages since the flight began, news alerts, emails, but only one mattered, from Malik. She made a mistake, but what happens after? That's where the real lesson begins. Amara exhaled slowly. She had a feeling Malik wasn't going to stop at an apology. He was just getting started. The plane cruised steadily through the sky, but inside the cabin, the air was heavy with quiet anticipation, the kind that settled over people when they sensed something bigger was building just beneath the surface. First class remained unusually still. Conversations were soft, glances were frequent, and the passengers who had once been preoccupied with their own comfort now sat uneasy, unsure of how to react to the shift that had taken place around them. Denise hadn't returned to the aisle since filing the incident report. She stood in the galley, arms folded tightly across her chest, eyes locked on the floor. For the first time in her career, she didn't feel like a crew leader. She felt like a name on a file, a problem to be handled. She had built her reputation on order, discipline, and knowing how to read people the moment they stepped on board. She prided herself on being able to spot who belonged and who didn't. But she had been wrong. And now, the shame wasn't just public. It was professional. Tanya glanced at her from the opposite counter, watching her silently crumble. She hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "I checked your file once," she said almost gently. "You've been flying for almost 11 years, right?" Denise didn't look up. 13. Tanya nodded. "Then you know how quickly things change." Denise let out a soft, bitter laugh. Apparently not fast enough. "You're not the first one to make a mistake," Tanya said. "No," Denise whispered. "But I might be the last one who gets to make one like this." Meanwhile, in the cabin, Amara finally closed her eyes. Not to sleep, but to rest from the noise inside her own head. She had been holding herself upright for hours now, keeping her body calm, her face composed. But it was exhausting, carrying grace in the face of disrespect, pretending that every comment didn't land, pretending that dignity came easy. She had learned how to keep herself still even when everything inside her was boiling, not because she was weak, but because she had no other choice. Black women like her were taught early, composure is protection. She exhaled slowly and leaned her head against the headrest. Then she felt it, someone shifting in the seat beside her. She turned her head just slightly and saw Malik. He had closed his tablet and now sat with one arm rested across the armrest, his other hand resting on his leg. His expression hadn't changed, but his silence was louder than any speech. She whispered, "You don't have to do anything else." He looked at her and replied softly, "That's not how I was raised." And with that he reached for the call button above his head. A quiet chime rang. The nearby passengers turned their heads slightly. Moments later, Tanya stepped through the curtain, her face polite. "Yes, sir?" "I'd like to speak to the in-flight supervisor," Malik said plainly. Tanya's voice didn't change. "That would be Denise, sir." "Then please let her know I'm ready to speak." Tanya hesitated only for a second, then nodded. "Yes, sir." She turned and disappeared behind the curtain again. Denise felt her stomach drop as soon as Tanya approached. "He wants to speak to you." Denise nodded slowly, wiped her hands on her apron, and took a long breath. Her palms were sweating. Her steps toward row 4 were slower this time, not with hesitation, but with the weight of everything she knew was coming. She reached his row and stood beside his seat. "Mr. Harris, is it?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. "Yes," he said. She swallowed hard. Would you prefer to speak privately? No, Malik said without raising his voice. Right here is fine. She nodded stiffly. Okay. Malik turned his body slightly to face her. I'm not going to raise my voice, he began. I'm not going to threaten your job. I don't need to, because what happened today spoke for itself. You saw my wife, and you made a decision. Before she said a word. Before you checked a list, before you looked at her ticket. Denise opened her mouth, but he held up a finger. I'm not interested in excuses, he said, still calm. I'm not angry because you made a mistake. I'm angry because you felt comfortable doing it. You didn't hesitate, you didn't question yourself. You questioned her, loudly, publicly, and with the kind of certainty that only comes from years of getting away with it. Denise's face flushed. Malik's voice lowered, almost to a whisper, but every nearby passenger leaned in to hear. You tried to shame her, and you did it in front of strangers, thinking she wouldn't say anything, thinking she'd just move. And she did, didn't she? Because that's what people like her are used to doing. Amara sat still, her eyes closed, listening to every word. Malik continued. But she didn't move because she was wrong. She moved because she didn't want to give you a reason to go further. She protected you from yourself. Think about that. Denise couldn't breathe. Malik leaned back slightly. The only reason you're still standing here in uniform is because she gave you that chance. The silence that followed was brutal. Malik didn't speak again. He didn't need to. Denise, eyes glossy, gave a stiff nod and turned to walk away. But before she reached the curtain, another passenger called out. I hope you remember this day, he said. She didn't turn back. She just disappeared behind the curtain. And this time, no one pretended not to watch. The remainder of the flight passed like a long, tense breath no one could release. Time moved, but it felt slow. The usual flight chatter was gone. No one asked for extra drinks. No one buzzed for a blanket. Even the clink of ice in glasses seemed louder than usual. The entire first-class cabin existed in a strange kind of quiet, like a courtroom after a verdict had been delivered. Amara remained in her seat, unmoving, not stiff, not cold, just centered. She didn't need to explain herself to anyone. Her presence alone was doing all the speaking now. No anger, no performance, just truth. It made people uncomfortable in the right way, the way that forced them to reflect. Malik scrolled through his phone silently, checking emails, replying to a few with short messages. But even in that, he was focused. Every move he made had intent, nothing wasted. He had already forwarded the incident report, the video request, and the passenger names to his team. By the time they landed, the company's senior legal officer and board liaison would have a complete summary of the event. Date, time, statements, names, recordings. Not because Malik wanted drama, but because he didn't believe in silence that protected the wrong people. In the galley, Denise sat alone on a fold-down seat, hunched slightly forward, hands clasped tight between her knees. She had taken off her blazer, wiped her face 3 times, and tried to think of what she'd say if someone asked her to explain what happened. But every version of the story sounded worse than the last, because there was no version where she came out looking decent. She had seen Amara and decided she was out of place. It wasn't about policy, it wasn't about protocol. It was about something deeper, something uglier, and Denise knew it now, fully. It wasn't the first time she had made that kind of assumption, but it was the first time the person she disrespected had power sitting 1 row behind them. She rubbed her temples, trying to fight off a headache that had been building since the moment she saw Malik rise from his seat. Tanya stepped in quietly, holding a bottle of water. You should drink something. Denise shook her head. I'm fine. Tanya stood there for a second longer. They're calling it already, you know, she said. The ground team. I overheard the captain. They've got security meeting the gate. And someone from the executive team. Denise's shoulders sank. Is that for me? Tanya didn't answer. It didn't matter. She already knew. Meanwhile, back in the cabin, passengers had started whispering, soft, hesitant conversations between couples and business travelers. No one dared speak loudly, but they were all talking about the same thing. A man in 3C leaned toward his wife and murmured, "Do you think she's going to lose her job?" His wife replied, "She should." Across the aisle, a younger woman whispered to herself, "I can't believe I just sat there." Even the passengers who hadn't been involved now found themselves asking questions they hadn't before. Why didn't I say something? Would I have spoken up if he hadn't? Why was her presence questioned before her ticket? The plane was no longer just a flight. It had become a mirror. The intercom crackled again. The captain's voice came through, polite and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent shortly. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened, tray tables are locked, and personal items are secured." Amara took a slow breath and fastened her belt. She glanced toward Malik, who gave her a brief nod. No words. Just that quiet look that said, "I'm here. I've always been here." She rested her hands in her lap and looked forward. She didn't need revenge. She didn't want anyone to beg. She just wanted accountability. Real accountability. Not a scripted apology, not a free flight voucher, but change. And if Malik had anything to do with it, that's exactly what would happen. In the front of the plane, the cockpit phone buzzed again. The captain picked it up and listened quietly. A voice on the other end informed him, "Mr. Harris's security detail has arrived at the gate. The company's executive officer is present. They're requesting to speak with crew immediately after disembarkation." The captain nodded once, then hung up. He looked toward the door with a sigh. He had flown this route for over 15 years. He had handled turbulence, emergencies, and mechanical delays. But he had never landed a flight knowing someone's career would end before the wheels even touched the runway. Back in the galley, Denise stood slowly, her body heavy. She adjusted her uniform, smoothed her shirt, and tied her hair back into a tighter bun. It was a habit she had done thousands of times. It had always helped her feel in control. But this time it felt like armor that couldn't protect her. The seatbelt sign chimed on. Outside the windows, the city came into view. Small roads, buildings, light breaking through thin clouds. Inside the plane, the quiet deepened. The descent had started, and so had the consequences. The plane touched down with a gentle thud, tires gripping the runway as the engines roared in deceleration. But inside the cabin, the moment didn't bring relief. There was no applause, no stretch of arms, no cheerful sighs. Instead, there was a stillness, a quiet, tight kind of anticipation, as if everyone on board knew that the landing wasn't the end of the flight. It was the start of something much more serious. In first class, Amara remained seated, her back straight, her face calm. Her eyes stayed forward as the aircraft taxied to the gate. She didn't glance toward the galley. She didn't shift in her seat. She simply waited, like someone who had learned long ago how to sit through uncomfortable silence without shrinking. Malik was just as composed. He placed his tablet into his carry-on, zipped it with care, then reached for his blazer. He moved like time didn't matter, like nothing around him could touch his focus. But anyone watching him closely could see it. He was preparing, not for a conversation, but for a correction. A reset of the system that allowed moments like this to go unchecked for too long. The intercom buzzed again. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. The local time is 3:45 p.m. For your safety, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the seatbelt sign has been turned off. Thank you for flying with us." That calm, robotic announcement had never sounded so cold. Ding. The seatbelt light turned off, but no one moved. All eyes went to the front of the cabin. The door hadn't opened yet. Denise stood behind the curtain, back straight, heart racing. She had pulled herself together physically, hair neatly pinned, uniform smoothed, name badge clipped perfectly in place. But nothing she wore could hide what was shaking inside her. She wasn't just nervous about a conversation. She was terrified of what came next, because she knew who would be waiting on the other side of that door. She wasn't preparing for a debrief. She was preparing for judgment. When the door finally clicked and opened, the tension inside the cabin broke like a stretched wire snapping. A uniformed security officer stepped into the entryway, He was tall, stone-faced, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who didn't speak unless necessary. "Is Denise Porter on board?" he asked, his voice calm but clear enough to be heard by every ear in first class. Denise stepped out from behind the curtain, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That's me. Please gather your items. You'll need to step off the aircraft immediately." The words fell like weights. A few passengers gasped softly. Others exchanged glances, the truth sinking in. This wasn't being brushed aside. It was real, and it was happening in front of everyone. Denise hesitated for half a second. Then she turned, grabbed her bag from the galley, and walked slowly toward the front of the plane. As she passed Malik and Amara, her eyes darted toward them, hoping maybe for some kind of last-minute mercy. But Malik didn't blink, and Amara didn't move. They just watched. When she reached the door, the security officer stepped aside and motioned for her to go first. She nodded stiffly and stepped into the jet bridge. But what she didn't expect was what she saw waiting for her outside the aircraft. Two airline executives stood with arms crossed, both in tailored suits, both wearing badges. The older of the two, a silver-haired man with a tight jaw, gestured toward the side hall. "This way, Ms. Porter." She followed without protest. Inside the cabin, the air remained frozen. Passengers stayed seated longer than necessary, watching the scene unfold with quiet awe. Some whispered, some avoided eye contact altogether, but no one could say they didn't see it. Amara finally stood, grabbing her bag with grace, adjusting the strap on her shoulder. She turned to Malik, who was now standing too, placing his bag on his shoulder with ease. "You sure you want to walk out with me?" she asked softly, a half smile on her lips. He raised an eyebrow. "I didn't fly all this way to sit behind you in silence." They stepped into the aisle together, heads held high, not out of pride, out of principle. As they made their way forward, one man in 3A stood briefly and cleared his throat. "Excuse me, ma'am." Amara turned slightly. I should have said something earlier. I'm sorry I didn't." She looked at him for a moment, then gave a soft nod. "Thank you." Another woman down the aisle stood. "You handled it better than I ever could." Amara offered a polite smile. "We all handle things differently. Some of us just don't have the luxury of loud reactions." No one else spoke. They didn't need to. By the time Amara and Malik stepped off the plane, the narrative had changed completely. She was no longer just that woman in seat 2A. She was the woman who had been wronged, stood her ground, and walked out without raising her voice once. And Malik? He hadn't needed to make noise. He had just shown up, watched the system act out its worst parts, and made sure it didn't go uncorrected. For Denise, the walk down the quiet corridor to the conference room felt longer than the entire flight. And for the airline? A new policy was about to be born. One born not from a press release, but from accountability, on the record, in full view. Inside the sleek, glass-walled conference room just past the terminal's restricted area, Denise sat alone at the long table. The fluorescent lighting above her buzzed faintly, and the silence felt too loud. A single water bottle sat untouched in front of her. Her hands rested on her knees, fingers intertwined, knuckles white with tension. Every tick of the wall clock behind her sounded like a countdown. Not to a meeting, but to a reckoning. 13 years in uniform. Thousands of flights. Hundreds of passengers. And now, her career stood on a ledge because of a moment she couldn't take back. The door opened, and in walked two executives. The first was the silver-haired man who had met her at the gate. His name badge read, Edmund Shaw, Senior Director of In-Flight Operations. The second, a younger woman in a navy pantsuit, closed the door behind them without a word. She placed a thin folder on the table and slid into a seat across from Denise. Edmund remained standing for a moment, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Porter," he began, his tone clinical. "Do you understand why we're here?" Denise nodded slowly. "Yes." "Then tell me," he said, "in your words." She cleared her throat. Her voice was dry. There was a misunderstanding. I questioned a passenger's seat in first class. She showed me her ticket, but I still asked her to move. Why? The woman across from her asked, flipping open the folder. Denise paused. She didn't look like someone who usually flies first class. The words hung in the air like a confession. The woman nodded, writing something down without comment. Edmund leaned forward slightly. And when she complied, when she moved without causing a disturbance, you felt that was acceptable? Denise hesitated. At the time, yes. But I understand now that it wasn't. You didn't ask anyone else to show their ticket, he said. No. You didn't question the white couple who boarded just before her. No. You only questioned her. Denise nodded again, her face pale. Yes. There was a pause. Edmund stepped back and took a seat. Do you know who her husband is? Yes, Denise whispered. What do you think he's going to do with this incident? The woman asked, looking up now. I don't know, Denise said. But whatever it is, I deserve it. Another pause. Then Edmund spoke. We have a recording of the incident from the cabin security system. We also have statements from 7 passengers, the captain, and your own junior crew member. All of them confirm the events as described. Denise closed her eyes briefly. I believe them. You should, the woman replied, because this is going higher than just a formal review. Denise looked up, alarmed. What does that mean? It means the company's executive board has been notified. The incident is being treated as a priority case, not only because of who was involved, but because this flight has exposed a larger pattern we can no longer ignore. She leaned forward slightly. You're not just here because of today. You're here because today is the day we finally got proof. Denise didn't speak. Edmund tapped the folder. You're officially suspended without pay, effective immediately. A disciplinary hearing will be scheduled within the next 10 business days. Until then, you are not to wear the airline uniform, access company systems, or enter restricted terminals. Violation of these terms will result in immediate termination. Denise nodded. Her face was still, but inside her heart was cracking open. She had spent years believing she was fair, that her instincts were good, that she could read people. But her instincts had failed her. And now, all she had built, her reputation, her routine, her sense of control, was gone. As the executives stood to leave, Edmund paused by the door. Ms. Porter, he said, if there's anything you should take from this, it's that people are tired. Tired of being judged before they even sit down. And you, today, you showed them exactly why. The door closed behind them, leaving her alone. Across the airport, in a quiet private lounge, Malik and Amara sat side by side. The room was dim, peaceful, with soft leather chairs and wide windows that looked out onto the runway. A private assistant brought them tea and left without a word. Amara took a slow sip and glanced toward Malik. So, that's it? He shook his head. That's the start. She raised an eyebrow. There's more? Malik nodded. The board's meeting this week. I've already submitted a full proposal. Mandatory bias training, anonymous reporting system, quarterly cabin audits, and direct feedback channels for passengers who've experienced discrimination. Amara looked impressed. All that in a few hours? He smiled slightly. I've been sitting on the plan for months. I was just waiting for them to stop pretending we didn't need it. She leaned back, folding her arms. And now they don't have a choice. There was a long pause. Amara looked down at her tea, then out the window. I didn't want her ruined, she said quietly. I just wanted her to see what she did. She will, Malik said, and she won't forget it. Amara nodded, because the most powerful lesson didn't come from punishment. It came from being seen, for once, as the one who had the right to be there. No explanation, no justification, just being and refusing to shrink. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, the lounge filled with golden light. Amara took another sip of tea, a hint of calm returning to her chest, and in the distance the plane that once carried a quiet injustice now sat still, its door open, its silence broken, its truth finally seen. By the next morning, the story had already started spreading, quietly at first, whispered between airline staff, then louder, leaking through private emails, travel forums, and eventually internal corporate circles. Not because Malik had posted about it. He hadn't said a single word publicly. But people talk, and passengers talk even faster when they witness something they know others won't believe unless it's repeated again and again. The version that traveled fastest wasn't the official incident report. It wasn't even the cabin recording. It was the memory. A poised black woman humiliated without cause. A man sitting behind her calm but unshakable. A flight attendant brought to silence in front of the very passengers she once tried to impress. And an ending where the silence worked against the system that had once protected it. In headquarters, meetings were called before noon. Legal teams scrambled to prepare language for the company's formal statement. Public relations executives huddled over laptops, rewriting drafts over and over, trying to find the exact balance of apology, accountability, and policy reform. Every word was weighed. Every sentence had stakes. The CEO, a tall, careful man named Richard Voss, reviewed the internal memo with a stony face. He had worked with Malik before, once in a funding round for airport sustainability. He knew Malik wasn't a man of empty movements. If Malik had been on that plane, and Malik had stayed silent until the end, that meant the damage was already done, and now the airline would answer for it. Across the city, in Malik and Amara's home, a quiet estate surrounded by tall trees and trimmed gardens, sunlight streamed through large windows as Amara stood barefoot in the kitchen, staring at her phone. Dozens of messages flooded her inbox. Friends, colleagues, acquaintances who had read between the lines of an anonymous post now going viral under the title, "The Woman in Seat 2A." No names, no airline mentioned, but the details were all there. The words were clean and sharp, the story told without exaggeration. No need for drama when the truth carried its own weight. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She moved when told. And somehow, she still became the problem. Until the man behind her stood up and everything changed. Amara didn't know who wrote it. Maybe a passenger. Maybe one of the quiet ones who watched but said nothing until now. But it didn't matter. The story had life now, and people were listening. She turned as Malik entered the room, holding his phone in one hand, a folder in the other. He kissed her on the forehead gently and set both down on the counter. "The board called this morning," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "And?" "They've scheduled a full review of in-flight behavior protocols," he replied. "Policy update will be mandatory, not optional. They're naming it after you." Amara stared at him. "What?" "It's not public yet," he said, voice calm. "But internally they're calling it the Thompson Clause. No passenger can be removed, questioned, or reassigned without ticket re-verification and supervisor confirmation, no matter what someone thinks they see." Amara blinked slowly, absorbing it, not out of pride, out of something deeper. Change. Real change. And it had her name on it. She sat down at the table, her voice low. "I didn't want all this attention." Malik sat beside her. "You didn't ask for it. You earned it." She looked at him. "What about Denise?" He was quiet for a moment. "Suspended. Final decision pending. She submitted a statement last night." "What did she say?" Malik pulled out the folder and handed it to her. Inside was a printed version of her written apology. No press-friendly words, no legal disclaimers, just a typed page, trembling with confession. "I made an assumption. I acted on it, and I hurt someone who did nothing wrong. This wasn't about a seat. It was about the lens I chose to see her through. And if this costs me my job, I accept that, because she deserved better. And next time, someone else will too." Amara read the letter slowly. When she finished, she placed it down. "She's not the only one who needed to read this," she said. Malik nodded. "That's why I sent a copy to the board." A pause hung in the air, soft and quiet. Not all apologies fix everything. But this one mattered, because it named what was broken, and once something is named, it can't go unseen again. Outside, the morning light stretched across the garden. Inside, Amara closed her eyes for a long moment, then opened them again. Steadier now. "I didn't speak for a reason," she said. "I know," Malik replied, "because I wanted them to hear their own silence." He nodded, and they did. She looked down at the letter once more, then folded it neatly, placing it inside the folder. "I'm keeping it." Malik smiled. Not for revenge, not for victory, but for memory. Because some moments aren't meant to be shouted. They're meant to be remembered. And this one would be by everyone who had been on that flight, and everyone who had ever been told, without a word, that they didn't belong. 2 weeks later, the airline released a public video statement. Not a press release. Not a tweet with 3 bullet points and a shallow promise. A full statement. Recorded. Clear. Acknowledging what had happened on Flight 827 in front of millions of viewers. The screen faded from black to the company's headquarters lobby. A tall woman in a navy blue blazer, Chief Operating Officer Elena Brooks, stood at a podium, a single sheet of paper in front of her. No teleprompter, no lawyer whispering in her ear. She looked into the camera and spoke without flinching. "There are moments that define whether a company is truly listening," she said. And Flight 827 was one of those moments. She paused. On that flight, a paying customer, Amara Thompson, was subjected to racial bias, public humiliation, and improper treatment by a member of our in-flight crew. No passenger should ever be treated as though they don't belong, especially not in the very seat they paid for. No deflection. No, if she felt offended. Just truth. "And we want to make one thing absolutely clear," she continued. "This did not go unnoticed. Thanks to the conduct of her husband, Mr. Malik Harris, who showed extraordinary restraint and professionalism, we were able to see the gaps in our system, gaps we are now committed to closing." She detailed the new policy. The Thompson Clause, now official airline regulation. Supervisors would now be required to confirm any seating challenge with digital ticket scans and internal documentation before any action could be taken. Crew members would receive bias and behavior training every 6 months, with real-world scenario testing. Each aircraft would have a designated passenger advocate among the crew. A new internal reporting system would allow passengers and employees to document incidents anonymously and directly to oversight. The statement ended with words no one had expected from a corporation used to hiding behind policy. "To Amara Thompson," Elena said, voice steady, "we not only apologize, we thank you for your grace, for your strength, and for choosing to stay seated when others would have walked away. Because of you, we are better." The video went viral within hours, not because it was polished, because it was real. People saw it and felt something move. Flight attendants around the world shared it in crew forums. Passengers began sharing their own stories, moments where they too had been spoken to differently, questioned without reason, asked to prove they belonged. But this time it was different, because now the silence had been broken. Back in the quiet of her home, Amara watched the statement on her phone, sitting in the same chair where she had first read Denise's apology. The sun filtered through the window beside her, casting soft shadows on the table. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just nodded once. Malik stepped into the room, holding a cup of tea, and set it down in front of her. "It's done," he said. She looked up at him, voice quiet. "Is it?" "For now," he said. "But not forever. Change doesn't end with one policy." She stirred her tea, thoughtful. "Number. But it has to start somewhere." He sat beside her. "And it started with you." Amara looked down at her phone again. Her name wasn't mentioned in hashtags. She hadn't posted anything. She hadn't held a press conference. But her story had moved without her needing to speak loudly. It had moved because it was true, and because enough people had finally decided to listen. A week later, Amara received a handwritten letter. It was simple, on airline stationery. No signature from a PR team, just a name she hadn't expected. Denise Porter. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know I've stepped down. Not because I was forced, because I needed to face who I was becoming. Thank you for standing still. It made me finally move. Amara folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer with the others, not to collect memories, but to remember the weight of moments that mattered. She stood by the window, looking out over the trees swaying gently in the wind. No audience, no spotlight, just peace. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like justice. Not the loud kind, the lasting kind. Because this wasn't a story about a seat on a plane. It was a story about what happens when someone chooses to stand still and lets the world come face to face with itself. And this time, the world listened. If this story touched you, make sure to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories coming soon. Your support means a lot.